Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're headed to the North Sea.
Oh, very nice. Sounds chilly.
It might be a little chilly out there,
Okay.
but the topic is definitely hot right now. We're diving into the controversy around two major UK oil and gas projects, Rosebank and Jackdaw.
Yeah, these are big ones, especially with this government in the UK.
Exactly. It's a real test for Labour's climate promises. Okay, so first, a super quick overview for anyone who hasn't been following this saga.
All right.
Rosebank, it's a giant. The UK's largest untapped oil field. We're talking about 300 million barrels of oil.
Wow.
Then there's Jackdaw, a smaller gas project.
Right.
Both got the green light from the previous government, but just recently, a Scottish court hit the pause button.
Ah, so that's where all the controversy comes in.
Yeah, this court ruling is a big deal.
It is. What happened?
Well, the court basically said the government's approval process was flawed. They didn't fully consider the climate impact.
Interesting. In what way?
They only looked at the emissions from extracting the oil and gas,
Okay.
not what happens when you actually burn it.
Ah, I see. So like ignoring the exhaust from a car,
Yeah.
you're focused on getting the fuel, but not the pollution from driving it.
Exactly. And those emissions from burning, those are called downstream emissions.
Right.
And there was a recent Supreme Court ruling in the UK that made it crystal clear.
Okay.
The government has to factor in those downstream emissions.
Wow. So that's a pretty big shift.
Huge. It's a game changer, not just for oil and gas. It even affected that proposed coal mine in West Cumbria.
No surprise then that climate campaigners are pretty happy about this ruling.
Oh, yeah. Groups like Greenpeace and Uplift are calling it a historic win.
Makes sense.
But what about the companies behind these projects? How are they reacting?
Well, you know, the developers, Shell, Equinor, Ithaca Energy, they're not denying that the initial approvals were maybe a little iffy,
Okay.
but they're pushing back pretty hard on halting the projects completely.
I can imagine. They've invested a lot of time and money, right?
Tons. And they're saying, hold on, these projects aren't just good for us, they're good for the whole UK.
Good. How so?
Well, take Rosebank, for example. Equinor, one of the big players there, claims it could bring billions into the UK economy.
Billions.
Yeah. And not just any billions, apparently a huge chunk of the investment, something like 77% or 6.6 billion, would go straight to UK businesses.
Wow. That's a significant boost.
It is. And, you know, that translates into jobs, not just in oil and gas, but all sorts of related industries, too.
So it's not just about the energy itself, it's about the whole economic ecosystem.
Right. And then there's the energy security argument. You know, with everything going on in the world, the UK wants to rely less on energy imports.
Yeah, that makes sense. But doesn't that kind of clash with their climate goals?
It does. And that's exactly the dilemma the new Labour government is facing.
It's a tough spot. They campaigned on a promise of no new North Sea oil and gas licenses.
Right.
But Rosebank and Jackdaw, they already have their licenses. They're just waiting for that final approval.
Yeah, it's a bit of a sticky wicket. You know, on one hand, they want to be seen as climate leaders. On the other hand, the UK still relies heavily on oil and gas. I think it's something like 2/3 of their energy still comes from fossil fuels.
So cutting off domestic production completely could be risky.
It could be. They need to find that balance.
You said it earlier, a real crossroads moment. It seems like they have to choose climate goals or keeping the lights on.
Pretty much. And this decision, it'll have ripple effects, not just for UK energy, but for their economy, their global image, everything.
It's a lot bigger than just two projects in the North Sea, isn't it?
Way bigger. And that's why we're here, to really understand what's at stake.
So we've got this big picture, these two massive projects in limbo, a new government facing a tricky choice. But let's zoom in a bit. Let's get into the details of these projects themselves.
Okay, sounds good.
Let's start with Rosebank, the big kahuna. It's located way out there, about 80 miles northwest of the Shetland Islands.
Wow, 80 miles offshore. That's a long way.
And in deep water, too.
Sounds like a logistical nightmare.
Oh, it is. Extracting oil from those depths, it's a huge undertaking. Cutting-edge technology, massive investment, the whole shebang.
So what kind of output are we talking about if Rosebank actually gets going?
Estimates suggest it could produce up to 50,000 barrels of oil per day.
50,000 barrels.
Yeah.
Every day.
At its peak, yeah.
That's a serious chunk of the UK's oil needs right there.
It is. Now, Jackdaw, it's a different beast altogether. Smaller scale, located closer to shore in the central North Sea, and it's primarily a gas project.
Okay, so Rosebank for oil, Jackdaw for gas.
You got it. Projections for Jackdaw suggest it could cover about 6% of UK gas demand.
So combined, these projects could really reduce the UK's reliance on energy imports.
Potentially, yeah. That's one of the strongest arguments in their favor. Boosting domestic energy production, less dependence on, let's say, less stable parts of the world.
Right. But of course, there's the flip side.
The environmental impact.
Exactly. Burning all that oil and gas, it's going to add to the UK's carbon footprint.
And make it much harder to meet their climate targets, right?
It would. The UK has made some pretty ambitious commitments, reducing emissions by a lot by 2030 and then aiming for net zero by 2050. Adding more fossil fuels to the mix definitely complicates things.
Yeah, it's a mixed message, isn't it? Climate leader on one hand, new oil and gas on the other.
That's the tightrope they're walking, trying to balance those immediate energy needs with the long-term goal of decarbonizing. It's not just a UK thing either.
Yeah.
Lots of countries are struggling with this.
Yeah, it's that global energy puzzle, trying to keep the lights on while we figure out a cleaner way to do it.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've laid out the basics. We've got these two big projects on hold, a government trying to figure out its next move, and a whole lot at stake for the UK and beyond.
Lots to think about.
There is. Now, the question is, how does this actually affect people's lives? What are the real-world impacts of all this?
Well, let's break it down, starting with the potential economic impact. Well, if Rosebank and Jackdaw do go ahead, it could create jobs for thousands of people.
Thousands.
Yeah, not just, in the oil and gas industry itself. We're talking engineering, construction, transportation, all sorts of related fields.
Okay, so that's a potential upside for the job market. But what about the cost of living for the average person? Would these projects have any impact on, energy bills?
That's a tough one to answer definitively. The developers, they argue that, producing more energy domestically could lead to more stable prices.
So less reliance on imports.
Right, and less vulnerability to global price shocks, which, could be good news for consumers in the long run.
That does make sense. But I've also heard the argument that investing in these big oil and gas projects could actually slow down the transition to renewables, which could end up being more costly down the line.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. Some experts say that, pouring money into Rosebank and Jackdaw could divert resources away from wind, solar, all those renewable sources that the UK is trying to ramp up.
So it's like this opportunity cost they could fall behind in the race for clean energy technology.
Exactly. And, that could have economic consequences in the long term as the world moves towards greener solutions.
So it's a bit of a gamble for the government, isn't it? They're weighing the potential short-term benefits against the risk of delaying the energy transition.
It is a gamble and a complex one at that. And of course, we can't ignore the environmental impact. Burning all that oil and gas is going to release a lot of greenhouse gases.
And that would directly impact the UK's ability to meet its climate goals, wouldn't it?
Definitely. It would make it much harder to achieve those targets they've set for reducing emissions.
So there are a lot of factors to juggle here. It's not a black and white decision.
Not at all. It's
Oh.
a web of interconnected issues. And the government's decision will have ripple effects far beyond just the energy sector.
How so?
Well, think about it. The UK is trying to be a global leader in climate action. Their decision on Rosebank and Jackdaw, the whole world is watching.
So it's not just about the projects themselves. It's about their reputation on the world stage.
Exactly. If they approve these projects, it sends a message. Maybe they're not as committed to tackling climate change as they say they are.
Right, and that could hurt their credibility in international climate negotiations.
For sure. It could make it harder for them to push other countries to be more ambitious.
It sets a precedent, doesn't it?
It does. And it's not just about the environmental impact either. It raises questions about their commitment to a just and equitable energy transition.
Hold on, what do you mean by a just transition?
So a just transition means ensuring that the shift to clean energy doesn't leave anyone behind. It's about supporting workers in those fossil fuel industries to find new opportunities.
So they don't get left stranded as the world moves away from oil and gas.
Exactly. It's about retraining, investing in new green industries, making sure that the benefits of clean energy are shared fairly across society.
So if the UK does decide to move forward with Rosebank and Jackdaw, they need to have a solid plan for those workers who might be affected.
Absolutely. They need to think about retraining programs, job creation in those renewable energy sectors, making sure those communities that have relied on oil and gas for so long aren't forgotten.
Wow. This is really eye-opening. It's not just about energy and climate change. It's about people's lives, their livelihoods, their communities.
It is. It's a human story at its core.
So with all these different angles, what do you, as an expert, think the government should do? What factors should they prioritize?
Well, ultimately, that decision rests with the policymakers. But I think it's crucial that they consider the long-term implications, not just the short-term gains, weigh the economic benefits against the environmental risks, and really make sure the transition to cleaner energy is just and equitable for everyone.
And it sounds like transparency is key. They need to communicate clearly to the public, explain the reasoning behind their decision, acknowledge the potential downsides.
Absolutely. Open communication and public engagement are essential. It's a complex issue with no easy answers. Everyone needs to be a part of the conversation.
Okay, so we've talked about the economic impacts, the environmental concerns, the global implications, but what about the legal side of things? That court ruling we mentioned earlier, it kind of threw a wrench in the works, didn't it?
It did. The court's decision basically sent Rosebank and Jackdaw back to the government for a do-over. They have to reassess those projects, take another look at the climate impact this time, considering those downstream emissions we talked about.
So it's not game over for the projects, but they're definitely facing an uphill battle now. What are the possible scenarios that could play out from here?
Well, there are a few possibilities. The government could decide to conduct a new environmental assessment, a more thorough one, that takes into account the full climate impact of those projects,
Yeah.
from extraction to burning. And if they find that the projects are still viable, they could give them the green light again.
Maybe with some stricter conditions or mitigation measures to address those environmental concerns?
Right. But on the other hand, if that new assessment shows that the projects would significantly impact the UK's climate goals, the government could decide to scrap them altogether.
And I imagine they could face legal challenges if they don't properly address the issues raised by the court.
Exactly. So they're in a tough spot. They need to balance the potential benefits with the environmental risks, the legal considerations, and the political pressure.
It's a high-stakes decision with far-reaching consequences.
It is. And this whole situation is a reminder that the transition to cleaner energy is going to be a bumpy ride. There will be challenges and tough choices along the way.
And it highlights how important it is to have these conversations to really understand the complexities, the trade-offs involved, so we can make informed decisions about our energy future.
Absolutely. And, there's no one-size-fits-all solution. What works for the UK might not work for another country. Each situation is unique.
So what can we learn from the UK's experience? What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into Rosebank and Jackdaw?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is that energy policy is incredibly complex. It's not just about the environment or the economy. It's about finding a balance between competing priorities, taking into account the needs of different stakeholders, making tough choices.
And recognizing that the path to a clean energy future isn't a straight line. There will be bumps along the way. We need to be flexible, adaptable, and always learning as we go.
Another key takeaway is that transparency and public engagement are crucial. People need to understand the trade-offs involved in these decisions, and they need to have a voice in shaping their energy future.
And that brings us back to you, our listeners. We've explored the ins and outs of these projects, the economic considerations, the political pressures, the environmental impacts. Now we want to hear from you.
What are your thoughts? What stands out to you? What factors do you think the government should prioritize?
We'd love to hear your perspectives, share your insights on social media, engage in discussions with your friends and family. Let's keep this conversation going.
What's striking me is that this whole Rosebank and Jackdaw situation, it's like a microcosm of this global energy dilemma.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Countries all over the world are wrestling with the same questions. How do we balance climate goals with the need to keep the lights on?
It's a tough balancing act, and there's no easy answer.
No magic formula that works for everyone.
Exactly. Every country has its own unique set of challenges, its own energy mix, its own economic and political pressures to consider. What works for the UK might be a disaster somewhere else.
And even within the UK, the situation is so messy and complicated, so many different factors to weigh.
Yeah, it's not just about the projects themselves. It's about the potential job losses, the shifts in entire industries, the way people live their daily lives, and all gets tangled up in this energy transition.
It really underscores how climate change isn't just an environmental issue. It's an economic issue, a social issue, a political issue. Absolutely.
Yeah.
It affects every aspect of our lives, and it demands a collective effort to find solutions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with something to think about.
Okay.
What lessons can we learn from the UK's experience with Rosebank and Jackdaw?
That's a good question.
How can we apply those lessons to the energy challenges that we face in our own communities, our own countries?
Well, I think the first step is education. The more we understand about these complex issues, the better equipped we are to make informed decisions and to hold our leaders accountable.
It's about having those tough conversations, weighing the costs and benefits, understanding that there's no perfect solution.
Right. It's about compromise and collaboration, finding ways to work together to create a sustainable energy future.
Because ultimately, this is about all of us. It's about the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of future we want to leave for generations to come.
Well said.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.
And most importantly, don't be afraid to get involved. Make your voice heard.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Cheers.